You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 49.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Laval St Germain is a Canadian adventurer who has so far climbed 6 out of the 7 highest mountains on every continent, including Everest, without oxygen. Laval was the first person to ski down from the summit of the highest mountain in Iraq. In June 2016, Laval successfully rode solo across the Atlantic Ocean from Halifax in Canada to Brest in France in 53 days, 8 hours and 26 minutes. In his day job, Laval is a Boeing 737 captain for Canadian North Airlines. In this episode, Laval talks about what it's like to explore the very edge of human performance. Enjoy the interview. Laval St Germain, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Hey, thanks, Matthew. I'm quite flattered and touched that you invited me on to Born to Kick Arse. I've listened to it many times and I really enjoy it, so here I am.
Now, you just went to gym before. How was a gym workout?
It was good, yeah. It's warmed up here in Calgary, Canada. It's about 0 degrees out and lots of slushy snow on the ground, but went out for a nice walk and went to the gym and just sort of cleared my head before the podcast interview, and it felt good. It's something I sort of need to do every day, either a run, a workout, or a bike ride. No matter what, it's my one of my key addiction, I think.
Do you sort of find it like I've never been to Canada, and I know it does get extremely cold in the winter. Do you find it hard to get up in the morning, when it's pitch black and it's freezing, to do something?
No, it's a good question, but you have to remember that being born and raised in this type of environment, it's completely normal. It would be, for me, talking to somebody from Queensland like yourself, Matthew. I mean, if I asked you if 30 degrees Celsius is too hot for you, you'd say absolutely not. That's just a nice day, maybe a little bit on the sort of normal to cool side, where here would be an absolute scorcher. So it's whatever you've become accustomed to. And yeah, it's, there's that old saying that there's no bad weather, just bad clothing. So you just dress for it. And if you didn't, you'd be locked up inside all the time. And don't tell anybody about it. The weather's really not that bad in Canada all the time. So
now in Calgary, is there a lot of large mountains that you can explore, either running, trail running through summer or skiing sort of nearby where you live?
Yeah, absolutely. We're only about I'm going to say, as the crow flies, about 80 kilometers from the Rocky Mountains. So driving there, it'll be about an hour to where you're sort of into the higher mountains. But we're within about 70K of the foothills. Yeah. So mountains that go up to about the 2,000 meter level type of thing. Yeah. But yeah, we've got lots of superb trail running capabilities or opportunities, I should say, and backcountry skiing opportunities are really good as well. So it's a real mountain playground in the Calgary area just west of us. So it's fantastic. I mean, it's no issue clicking into your skis for a day of backcountry skiing an hour and 20 minutes after leaving the house.
Have you seen any bears? Like in summertime or even spring, have you seen any at all?
Oh, yeah. You see bears, and but I've never actually had a run-in with a bear. Well, that's not true. I have had to climb what's called a pump jack, which is a thing that pumps oil here. And when I was up in the bush as a kid working from a bear trying to get me. But other than that, I've, touch wood, haven't had any run-ins with black bears, polar bears, or grizzly bears. And polar bears are obviously to the north of us in the Arctic, but I've been very fortunate.
Yeah, bears, coming from this side of the world, I'm I'm always thinking bears, and like maybe others thinking of Australia, people are sort of thinking of snakes and stuff like that, but bears sort of jump out at me.
I'd much rather deal with a bear than snakes and all the strange insects you guys have. So give me a bear any day.
Yeah. Now, you're quite an incredible human. You've done a lot of things that we'll talk about. You're a Boeing 737 pilot. You've summited Everest without oxygen. You've rode solo across the Atlantic Ocean. You've climbed the highest mountain in Iraq and then skied down it. Trail running, ultramarathon running. Can we talk about flying first? How did you get into flying and becoming a pilot?
Well, it's an interesting story. My father had a private pilot license, so he wasn't a commercial pilot, but we always had a small plane sort of around when I was growing up. So I always knew I was going to get my license so that I could fly. My dad saw that I was always reading about explorers, specifically the explorers that had to do with Canada. So the Scottish explorers, the French voyageurs, and the English explorers who opened up the Canadian Arctic to the Europeans and Western Canada. And then National Geographic was something that was around our house all the time. In fact, we just got the newest edition in the mail today. My son was just reading it. So he saw that I was always interested in travel in faraway places. And he said, what you should do? You should become an airline pilot, because as an airline pilot, you'll have the opportunity to have travel passes on airlines all over the world and travel for next to nothing. So I said, okay, that's a good plan. I was 15 years old. I signed up for the technical part of the training, the classroom training, which is called the ground school. And by the time I was 16, I had my student pilot license, private pilot license at 17, commercial at 18. And after flying in the bush, which is where we fly in the remote areas of northern Canada, building up experience, I was hired by the airlines at age 21. And that completely opened the world to me to adventuring, because I could travel for next to nothing all over the planet. And, I'm really thankful that my dad inspired me to become a pilot. I didn't become a pilot because I was a real aviation nut, although I did like flying. I liked the opportunities that flying afforded me more so, I think.
You fly a Boeing 737. Is that what you regularly fly today?
Yeah, that's all I'm checked out on today. Generally, as an airline pilot, you're checked out on one type of aircraft. Yep. So I've been flying the Boeing 737s since 2001. Prior to that, I flew everything from the round engine, single engine float planes to smaller twin engine turboprops. To a bunch of different types of aircraft, from Dash 8s, which I'm sure you've seen all over Australia, and Fokker F-28s. In fact, I picked one up once in Perth and flew it to Africa from Australia. So all kinds of different aircraft I've flown, but for the past, since 2001, it's been the Boeing 737.
And do you have like a main route that you do normally in your day job? Do you sort of go from Calgary to a particular city and back and forth, or do you just sort of go around?
We didn't used to have that, but with we've had a real downturn in the economy here in the province that I live in Alberta, because of the fact that we are a province that's pretty much only we rely almost 100% on oil and oil prices. And with the drop in the oil prices, the activities dropped off quite a bit, and the opportunities for airlines all over Western Canada have decreased. But so the routing that I do, and since I'm so senior, I get to kind of choose where I want to go, is generally from Calgary up to these towns up in northern Alberta that service this oil business. So these are generally private runways, large runways that oil companies build to bring their workers in and out. It would be very similar to from an Australian standpoint, the fly-in, fly-out programs that some of the large coal mines have. Yeah. And it's almost identical to that. But we do have a charter component that does charters all over the U.S., and then as well as We specialize in Arctic flying. So we go as far north as the northernmost airport on the planet, which is called Alert, up on Ellesmere Island in the very high Arctic of Canada. So very unusual flying and unique flying. In fact, we even land Boeing 737s on gravel and on frozen lakes. So it's pretty unique. Yeah.
How slippery is that?
It's not, because they go onto the runway and they scarify it. So that basically they make it almost like a corduroy pattern that makes it quite grippy on the tire. So it's not slippery at all. But yeah, we can. These airplanes are pretty amazing what we can do with them. So it's one day you might be in Las Vegas doing a charter, and then a couple of days later, you could conceivably be landing on a frozen lake in the Canadian Arctic. So pretty awesome.
How many people are in your hands, like on average, like that are?
Well, the aircraft I'm flying right now holds 136 passengers, and with 3 flight attendants and obviously my first officer, the co-pilot. Yeah. So so you're 140 passenger, 140 people or souls on board, we say roughly. And we have another model of 737 that we land on gravel runways with, and that's about 112 to 114 people, depending on the specific aircraft. So they're a 737 is a regional airliner. It's meant to fly sort of within North America. We do charters to Greenland. We've done them to Norway. In Central America, but it's generally a fairly short range, 5-hour type of machine is what we say.
What's more dangerous, the takeoff or the landing, or are they equally as dangerous, in terms of risk?
Yeah, if you look at first of all, airline flying is very, very safe. It's unbelievably controlled. I mean, so much so that the medical industry and hospitals, etc., are trying to mimic what we do in aviation when it comes to managing errors, communication either in the cockpit or in the operating theater, crew resource management, which is something, the acronym is CRM, the way that you communicate with your other crew members or in a hospital environment with nurses and other doctors. So having said that, aviation is unbelievably safe and low risk. But if you look at it statistically, the highest number of accidents occur during takeoff and landing. And I would say landing would be higher than that because of a phenomenon that is largely disappeared now because of technology, which was called CFIT, C-F-I-T, Controlled Flight into Terrain. But we now have systems on the airplane that make that extremely difficult, especially in countries like Australia, Canada, the US, Western Europe, New Zealand. Western trained pilots with this technology, it almost never happens. But statistically, it would be takeoff and landing. Cruise is pretty benign. There's nothing that goes on up there.
Do you have any tips with regards to recovering from jet lag?
Yeah, I don't. So if I were to fly over and pay you a visit in Australia, I'd get right down to it and try and mimic your schedule. I don't nap when I get there. And I force myself to try and adapt to the local time zone as quickly as possible. So if I'm going to Europe, which I do quite often, and I get off the airplane, I just force myself to push into the time zone where I'm at. So there's about a 7 or 8 or 9 hour time difference between where I'm sitting in Europe. And yeah, for the first few days, you're going to feel, probably a week actually, you're going to feel out of sorts. But if I nap, it just prolongs the acclimatization to the new time zone.
Just on stress, an airline pilot, you've got over 100 souls in your hands. Mm-hmm. That type of stress versus the stress of doing something like attempting to summit Everest, where you've really only got your own life in your hands. Do you sort of differentiate between those?
Yeah, it's completely different. And to be perfectly frank, I don't ever really feel stressed no matter what the conditions are flying. I've been doing that since I was 15. So, it's so second nature to me flying that, believe it or not, I actually sort of relish the bad days, the really dodgy weather and the big crosswinds and the slippery runways, because you can really put your skills to the test in a controlled, strict environment. But I don't ever, line up on the button of the runway and think that it's what I'm doing is risky. Now, when it comes to sticking your neck out at over 8,000 meters in the Himalayas, that's something completely different, because the responsibility I feel there is, first of all, that innate a need to survive, but also to not to not get killed and never see my family again. So it's completely different, and I really don't have. I can't really compare it, because I don't find that flying as stressful. I think there's a level of responsibility for sure, and sort of a sober responsibility. And I think it's a bit of an oxymoron, or maybe a strange juxtaposition, if you will, where I'm an airline pilot in this super safe, super controlled environment, not taking any risks. But in my other life, I do things like climb Everest without oxygen, or row across the North Atlantic solo. But in a way, they seem to work for me, because I take the lessons I've learned from aviation, meaning the risk management, the checklist usage, the following the procedures, the concern for task, meaning that, you say really focus on what you're doing. You don't let your mind wander. The redundancies in equipment, the redundancies and the stuff, the gear that you pack and the kit that you carry with you, all that stuff transfers very easily, I think, into sort of extreme sports, and sports where you're really on the edge, meaning either very remote or at the limits of human performance. Yeah. So I think it works really well.
Do you think if you hadn't have been a pilot, that may have affected your adventurous pursuits somewhat in terms of the planning and the logistical side of things?
I think it would have. I think it would have. Not that probably there's very few airline pilots that do this stuff that I do. So the vast majority of people don't have that background. It's probably something that's more right from a character that a characteristic that they have. But if you really, for example, on my ocean rowing boat, I have a checklist, a laminated checklist that I had posted on the wall, and it was an abandoned ship checklist that I modeled exactly like our evacuation checklist on a Boeing 737. And I sat there and I, for hours, decided on the steps I was going to take, so that when things went wrong, if I had struck something at sea, been hit by a boat, a whale knocked off the rudder, I capsized and wasn't coming upright again, that I would be able to calm down, grab the checklist, and get out of that boat alive without making any mistakes or forgetting to do something. So I think that type of procedure is something that comes from being an airline pilot. I don't think other ocean rowers would be that specific. They would rehearse it, they would talk about it, they would take their sea survival training, but would they have a laminated checklist on the wall? I'm not sure.
Tell us about, I believe there's a term in the flying industry called procedural drift. Mm-hmm. What's that?
Yeah, so it would be like if you were traveling to and from sort of your regular route at home, Matthew, and every day you drove through a stop sign without stopping and nothing ever bad happened. So instead of coming to a complete stop and looking left and right, you sort of looked left and right and went through the intersection at 50 or 60 kilometers an hour every day. You would have no negative repercussions from what you did, so you'd continue to do it. So the normal procedure, the correct procedure would be to come to a stop, look left and right, a full stop, and drive through the intersection. But without any negative feedback from you doing something you're not supposed to do, it doesn't stop you from continuing to do it. So to use that in an example, that if I, using the ocean rowing example, I always put on my safety line. So it's like an umbilical cord that you tie to a jack line on the boat, and it prevents you from getting washed overboard. And of course, that would be it. You'd be dead. However, during the entire ocean row of 53 days across the North Atlantic, I only got nearly washed overboard or saved by that umbilical cord or that safety line about 4 times in 53 days. So very, very low opportunity to get washed overboard. So I could have easily gone for, let's say, 30 days at a time and never worn that harness and never suffered any real repercussions. But the one time that I'm not wearing the harness, I get washed over. Yeah. That would be the epitome of procedural drift, both, in this example, literally and figuratively, because I'd be drifting away from the boat. So in aviation, we're taught that too, that if you don't do your a certain checklist every single time, and you start to skip it, one of these times one of the items on the checklist isn't going to be accomplished, and you're going to make a mistake and lose the aircraft. So.
Also, with the training and the experience you've had as a pilot, are you quite familiar with reading the weather and the wind? Sort of
Yes.
taking that into account with certain expeditions and stuff like that. How sort of familiar are you with that?
Yeah, the meteorology training that we get as pilots is pretty important, obviously, because the vast majority of outdoor adventurers rely on weather. I mean, that can kill you, obviously, and so much so that my wind, weather, and waves guy for my expedition was the manager of dispatch at Canadian North, the airline I work for, a guy named James Redeker, Jim Redeker, and we relied on him even on Everest to give us weather. And this guy is not an adventurer, not an outdoorsman, knows nothing about the Himalayas, has never been at sea, but he turned himself into a real guru when it comes to Himalayan weather and ocean weather. Oh, wow. So he was able to. We treated it just like I was the pilot and he was the dispatcher, and we were able to put together the best flight plan, in quotations, if you will, that got us across the ocean alive. And some of the decisions we made together as a team, meaning him as my wind, weather, and waves guy, and myself, made all the difference in the world. So much so that at one point there was another ocean rower who had left New York City a month before me. I had left Halifax, Canada, and he on June 15th, and he left a month earlier from New York City in the U.S. And at one point, we came within 8 nautical miles of each other on the we used nautical miles on the ocean or in the marine world. So he came 15 kilometers away, so close that at times I was out looking for him. Within a day or so of us brushing by each other that close, I never did see him. We got hit by a storm at the same time, and I decided to run with the storm, and meaning that just let the boat get swept along towards Europe by the storm. And the storm was big enough that I believe he decided to go onto sea anchor, which is like a large underwater parachute that slows your drift down and keeps the bow of the boat directly into the waves, which is obviously what you want, right? Yeah. And so I was tumbled along, literally capsizing repeatedly for about 4 days. And by the end of that storm, I was 200 nautical miles ahead of him. And just because of that move, the way all the subsequent weather systems hit me and him, I got the advantage of the winds pushing me to towards the east, towards Europe, and he got either pushed north, south, or even back towards North America. And eventually, his boat was heavily damaged and he had to be rescued up in the North Atlantic. So, a little bit of luck involved, but I credit that a lot with the decision that my team, meaning Jim Redeker and I, made to run with it. So,
yeah, that would have been good having him on board with on your team.
Yeah, fantastic.
Tell us about the 7 summits. What are the 7 summits?
So the highest mountain on all 7 continents, and I'm going to apologize right now to all of Australia because mountaineers have eliminated Kosciuszko as one of the continental high points.
Yeah, that's more of a hill.
Yeah, it's more of a hill, a ski hill. So of course that's been replaced with the highest mountain in all of sort of Australasia, Southern Asia, and that would be Karsten's Pyramid in Papua province of Indonesia. So having said that, we'll start from your region. So we'll go Karsten's Pyramid, the highest in Australasia, including Australia and New Zealand. And then we go to Asia, which is obviously Everest. And then we'll go to the next one would be heading towards Europe, and that's Mount Elbrus, which is in southern Russia in the Caucasus Mountains. So not too far from the war-torn area of Chechnya and the Republic of Georgia. And then we go across the Atlantic and we go to the highest mountain in North America, which is Denali. It's in the U.S. It's in Alaska. And then from there we go to South America, staying in the Western Hemisphere, and it's Aconcagua. That's the highest mountain in South America and the highest mountain in the Western Hemisphere. Across to Africa, of course, Kilimanjaro. We're all familiar with that, the highest mountain on the continent of Africa. And then down to Antarctica, which is Vinson. So I've done all of those except Vinson. Yep. And Vinson will be the next of the 7 summits that I do. But my problem is that I'm a I've got a little bit of ADHD when it comes to adventuring. I like all kinds of different adventures. So I'm just not just a mountaineer. I like getting on my bike. I like getting on my fat bike. I like running and, ocean rowing and all kinds of stuff. So it's, I'll fit that one in here soon.
Ironman triathletes, like a lot of people, you sort of see that after they've completed an Ironman, they'll go out and get the Ironman logo tattooed on themselves.
Yeah.
When you complete the 7 summits, you're going to get like a 7 summits tattoo.
Geez, I don't know. I've never really thought about that, but I know my daughter had brought it up that when I climbed the 7 summits, that I should get a ice axe in the shape of a number 7 somewhere in my body. But I have no tattoos at the moment, and I don't have any intentions to get any. I've got scars and stuff, but no tattoos.
One of the ones that you've summited, Mount Everest, the big one. If we just sort of leave that for the time being, is there, of the other summits that you've done, what would be the next hardest, both physically and mentally challenging? Of those other ones on the different continents, was there one that sort of sticks out more so than the others in terms of difficulty and challenging?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I think that the one that stands out to me would be the first one. So I think it's like a first romance or first love, and that was Aconcagua down in Argentina. I was only about 22 years old when I flew down there and did that one solo on my own. I did a route that was off the normal route. It was called the Polish Glacier Direct, or the Glaciar de los Polacos, and I summited that. And the year before, I had climbed the highest mountain in Bolivia, a very remote mountain called Cerro Sajama. And on that one, I just about died from the altitude. My buddy that I climbed with, a fellow pilot actually, Derek Thomas, thought that I was going to get the chop one night. I was so ill, but we made it to the top. It was an absolute sufferfest, that trip. And but believe it or not, I was hooked on high altitude mountaineering. So I decided that I wanted to make sure I could function at altitude. So I flew to Argentina. I did Aconcagua. I felt very good at the top, and I was hooked on what I thought was high altitude, which was only 7,000 meters. Yep. But high enough to sort of stretch your high altitude legs. So that one was extremely special. But for the difficulty, all round difficulty, it's none of the 7 summits. It's Canada's highest mountain, which is the second highest mountain in North America. It's called Mount Logan. It's very remote. It's on the Alaska-Yukon border. Very cold. You fly in with a ski plane, you get dropped off, and you make that satellite phone call 2 or 3 weeks later to get picked up. But I did the East Ridge on Mount Logan, and the reason it was so difficult is we carried our skis as well because we wanted to ski off the summit. So myself and an Australian climbed that mountain, and we skied from down the opposite side. So that was a very difficult, cold trip, and that one really stands out. But for physiological challenge, it would be Everest for sure. That summit day is something that's very difficult to describe, the pain you go through. So physiologically, that's the toughest. All around was Mount Logan, Canada's highest peak, and for truly being special, it was Aconcagua.
Now with Everest, when you summited that in May 2010, how long prior to the summit did you have Everest in your sights?
Yeah, since I was about 11 years old, believe it or not, I had it in my sights. And then when I read about Reinhold Messner, so he summited in solo in 1980. I don't remember that. I didn't read it at the time, but of course I read about it later. And then I was really inspired by a Canadian mountaineer named Patrick Morrow. And Patrick Morrow is the first person to climb all of the 7 summits. Now that generally is thought to be an American climber from Texas, I believe. But Pat Morrow is the first guy that did them all and climbed Karsten's Pyramid as the highest mountain in Australasia versus Kosciuszko, where the American and I hate to do this to an Australian, but he just did the Aussie high point. So this guy lives about 100 kilometers west of here, and he was a real inspiration, a photographer, a telemark skier like myself, and I read about his exploits and read some of his books and thought I'd like to do what Pat Morrow did. So
Yeah.
so that's so that would have been in the early 1990s, late 1980s, where I really sort of got the idea of someday getting to Everest.
You've done you've done heaps of adventures and expeditions. How do you fit that in with your day job? Do you get heaps of time off, like as a pilot?
You do, and I've been able to take leave of absences for the longer ones. So I took a leave of absence for the ocean crossing and for the Everest expedition. So I've been very fortunate that way that I've picked a job where I can do that. And for many, many years, I was the chief pilot at this airline. So I was able to sort of get my work done whenever I could get my work done instead of just going 9 to 5. And I was able to bank a lot of vacation that way and pull off some of these trips. But yeah, I've been very, very lucky to have a job and an airline that's allowed me to take this time off.
Yeah. Now, just the other thing with funding these expeditions, do you fund these yourself, or do you sort of have sponsorship, or a bit of both? How does that sort of work?
Yeah, my wife Janet likes to say that I'm sponsored by MasterCard, but it's my own MasterCard.
Yeah.
So they've all been self-funded except for the Ocean Row. I had sponsorship for that, but that only paid for about a third of the trip. I had a lot of gear donated from companies like Helly Hansen, True Blue Eyewear, and then cash that came in from other corporate donors, including some of those. So that it paid for about a third of the trip. So sponsorship is always an issue whenever you do expeditions because these things are not cheap. I mean, the Australian and the Canadian dollar are fairly similar right now, and it was well over $100,000 to do an ocean row. So not a cheap hobby, but I think it's money well spent. I don't have any other bad habits, so it's I think it's good to invest in experiences.
Yep. Now with Everest, you climbed this without oxygen. When did you when you sort of committed to yourself mentally, I'm going to make a beeline for the summit of Everest? Did you also think at that point, I'm going to do this without oxygen, or did the without oxygen part come a little bit later?
No, it was always without oxygen, and it was interesting. The expedition that I was on was called a lead expedition. You don't have a guide. You don't have you can, if you want, pay for your own Sherpa, that type of thing. I didn't have that, and all the climbers climb with oxygen. So I decided what I was going to do is get to Everest, train as hard as I could before I got there. Once I was at base camp, instead of spending time laying around drinking tea and acclimatizing to the altitude, I'd go and I'd climb the nearby peaks surrounding the base camp in Tibet, on the Tibetan side of Everest, going on long hikes, going off by myself in the distance and actually working out and forcing myself to acclimatize, but also showing the expedition leader that I was super fit and that I was capable of doing that. So eventually you're there for 2 months on that mountain. Eventually it got to the point where I just told that people on my expedition were starting to see without oxygen, which was my plan. And eventually I approached the leader and I said, here's my plan. And he did not hesitate because he saw that I was fit and I was having no issues at altitude. So for some reason, everything clicked. I mean, I know that you're a runner, and some races, everything clicked. Not that Everest was a race, but everything clicked physically on that trip. And so much so that that I was beating the Sherpas up to various camps, carrying the same amount of gear at times. So everything just worked out really well with my fitness and my health. And it was an absolute wondrous trip.
With oxygen, typically if someone was going to climb it with oxygen, how many oxygen canisters or tanks would you normally take up? Would you take a couple up normally?
That's a good question.
And also, how much do they weigh?
That's a good question. I have no idea because I didn't touch a bottle of oxygen, nor did I even put one on.
Yep.
What we had to do, though, as a team, was fit the oxygen mask to our face and get a lesson on how to use it. But that's as close as I got to oxygen. So I'm going to guess that an oxygen bottle must have weighed about 5 or 6 kilos, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And, for a fit climber, I'm going to say it would take, I'm just totally guessing here, but probably 4 bottles, I think, to go from, it all depends on the flow rate and that type of thing. But I'm not really sure. So you're asking the wrong guy when it comes to Everest oxygen, luckily.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking if there was a number of sort of tanks that you'd need to take up, the weight of those alone would be taxing.
Yes.
But obviously the benefit is you're getting oxygen. But
yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because that's one thing I didn't want to do, is have that weight. I figured if I needed oxygen, I shouldn't be up there. And also, if you're using oxygen, one of the risks, I think, is that you rely so much on that oxygen. So there's a lot of incidents where people go up there and the oxygen mask freezes or the regulator freezes. So it would be like doing a scuba dive and all of a sudden losing your regulator. I mean, you're coming to the surface, or on Everest, you're going down or worse. Yeah. And if you rely on oxygen only, and like I said, something goes wrong with that mechanical aspect, meaning the actual O2 bottle, you're in, it's like doing a spacewalk. You're on your own, and you're not going to last long if you're totally dependent on that oxygen bottle. So by going without oxygen, if you're able to do it physiologically, I think it actually reduces the risk in some respects in sort of an unusual way. If you look at it that way, you're not relying on that one piece of equipment to get you up there.
With regards to your training leading up to the Everest summit, was there anything in particular that you did with your approach for training? Was there anything that you did specifically for this expedition?
Not really. I think my training is all based on, I try and do an all-round type of training. If you look at my some of the training videos and images on my website, you'll see that my physique is not like your typical endurance athlete. I'm not extremely skinny. I do have some muscle on me, but I'm a light guy. And I think, and the reason I train both in the gym, running, cycling, ultra running, is because I think you need an all-around fitness to do these expeditions. And what I mean by that is, if you train just to go up hills, if you train just to climb with crampons in a high altitude mountain, that's great. But there comes a point where you're going to have to do something like rescue somebody from a crevasse, carry out an injured person, carry a really heavy load, twist and turn with a 50-kilo backpack, or lift heavy rocks to fasten your tent lines down during a storm. And if you get injured, now you could be in a situation where you may not make it. I mean, there's no room for injury or equipment failures, meaning like your body has equipment failing up there. So I try and do a real all-around physical routine where strength training is important, especially in the core. And that way you build yourself into an all-round physique for adventuring, meaning you can climb, you can haul in a sea anchor at sea, which is very heavy and hard on the arms, or you can haul a buddy out of a crevasse when he falls in a crevasse, or dig somebody out of an avalanche. And I think that's what you really need to be an all-round adventure athlete, is that all-round physique. And so for Everest, that's what I did. I just maintained my regular training schedule. And I mean, lots of running stairs here in the city that I live in, lots of cycling. And then when I got to Tibet, I mean, even when I was in Kathmandu preparing, I'd run every day up to the top of the Monkey Temple, which is a famous temple in Kathmandu, a big long staircase up there. I'd run to the top every morning and do repeats on there to train. So I never missed any training whatsoever. As soon as we got into Tibet and we were staying in various towns as we drove through Tibet to base camp, I'd go running in the hills, and it was pretty spectacular because I'd be running in areas, where you're seeing Tibetan blue sheep and other wildlife. And it was, so by the time I got to base camp, I was already turning into a high altitude animal.
Yeah. Did you have any of the yak tea?
No, we did not have any yak butter tea at all, that I remember. No. All right. But that salty, rancid tea, I don't remember having that.
Yeah. How much of a factor is dehydration when you're up above base camp? On Everest, is that a big factor, dehydration?
Yeah, because your body's building additional hemoglobin, red blood cells, and because of that, it turns a little bit sludgy or thickens up. Blood pressure tends to rise. You want to make sure that you're drinking lots of water. But I do know that on the summit day, I only drank about 300 milliliters of water in 17 and a half hours. And that's just because
300
at
mils in 17
300
hours.
mils.
Jeez.
Yeah, nothing at all. Basically, a couple of gulps. And that's just because, for me, at least at altitude, when I get sort of above 7,000 meters, while you're actually climbing, hunger and thirst start to disappear. Thirst not so much, but hunger especially. And I think that I was in just such a state of suffering that I was too lazy to take my rucksack off and grab my water bottle out of it. And by the time I was done that 300 mil, it was frozen anyway. So
Tell us about that final push, from the high camp. Is there a high camp? Because you came up from the Tibetan side.
yeah, the high camp on that side is higher than the high camp on the Nepali side, which is good. So you don't have as long a summit day, but so it's the highest camp anywhere on Earth, and we're on about a 20-degree slope. There's no really good spot to pitch a tent. It was pretty foreboding place. There was the body of a dead Serbian climber laying right beside our tent, frozen there, and it's to me, and I've spoken about this before, it's the ultimate expression of stepping outside your comfort zone when you take that zipper down on that tent at high camp on Everest to step out into the Himalayan night to climb without oxygen. And there are a lot of things that go through your mind before you step out of that tent, but you really have to have your game face on, and you have to be really mentally prepared. And believe it or not, and I didn't have any concerns that I was going to make it. I was just so confident on that trip. Looking back at it now, and I look at the video of us just about to take a little nap before we spent 3 hours in the tent, and 11 o'clock at night as we were getting up to climb to the summit. I sound so confident, so sure of myself. Looking back at how hard that was, though, especially on the descent, I can't believe how confident I was. But it is a pretty mind-focusing moment when your boots are on, and it took about 15 minutes per boot because you're so strapped for oxygen, and then to unzip that tent and step out and know that you're in for maybe a 24-hour or a 20-hour sufferfest. It was quite the analogy for stepping out of your comfort zone.
Yep. And what was it like on the top?
It was overcast, low visibility, no view, and I was so addled. My mind was so addled from lack of oxygen that at one point, as I was going along the summit ridge, following boot prints, I thought I was following what we call the snowmobile or skidoo track, which is what we use to travel across frozen snow here. I'm sure you know what that is, but I thought that I was following a snowmobile track, and it made perfect sense to me. And, I shook my head and got out of that mindset, but I got to the top and I summited with one of my teammates. I left the tent with Gavin Vickers from Australia, Mark Delstange from London, and myself. They were climbing with oxygen and I wasn't, and I pulled ahead of them. And then about 16 hours later, maybe 15 hours, about 8 hours later, Mark caught me on sort of the final slope to the summit, and we walked up there together. It was around 10 or 10:30 in the morning, if I recall, and I said, 20 minutes, mate, not a second more. We got to get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
We were exactly 20 minutes, and then the real suffering began descending. The descent was something that's very difficult to describe how tough it was.
Like I've heard other interviews that you've done where you mentioned that you're physically and mentally fatigued, and you were sort of continually overwhelmed with that feeling of wanting to just stop and rest and sleep. And knowing if you did sleep, you would never wake up. Tell us about that sort of feeling and how you managed to not sleep and just to continue.
Yeah, I was. It's like anything. If I asked you about your hardest ultra run, you'd kind of be able to describe it, but you'd never be able to tell me how much it hurt. If I asked you to describe a sunset over the ocean there in Queensland, you could probably describe it very easily, and I could be right there with you, understanding it. So I think people have a lot of difficulty remembering pain, and they say that's why women only have one, or that women will have more than one child, is because they forget pain. I think that's why we keep going back and hurting ourselves in the mountains. And I remember I was so completely knackered on that descent, and I knew that if I napped, I was going to die. But I had built this narrative, and I had justified that, well, at least if I napped and I died in my sleep, I'd have a long nap. And that started to make sense to me. It was starting to be quite comfortable. So off in the distance on the descent, I saw a destroyed tent on this, below this steep ridge I was descending. And I was walking, Matthew, about 10 meters and sitting in the snow, 10 meters sitting in the snow, 10 meters sitting in the snow for hours. And I saw this tent, and I decided I was going to take that nap. As I got close to the tent started to sort of appear in the mist, and it wasn't really a tent at all. It was a dead guy laying there, another mountaineer that had died. And as I got closer, it was I could see a Canadian flag on his arm, and it was a Canadian from my city of Calgary who had tried to climb Everest without oxygen in 2009, 1 year before, and he was laying there napping, and he looked like he was napping. And so when I saw him taking that nap, it really woke me up and kept me going on the descent. And there was no more thoughts of napping after that. But it's difficult to describe the exhaustion and how incredibly painful it is to descend in that condition. But yeah, I came close.
Yeah. Where do you think that extra strength came from?
I don't know. I don't know if it was from some primitive part of my brain or something that's there in all of us. I mean, you have to consider that, people go through a lot worse than climbing Everest without oxygen, I think. And I think that the reason that there's 7 billion people in the world is that we can adapt to anything and live in just about any environment. So I think it was just something that was there. I didn't sort of, there was no trick or no mantra that I used to get down. I mean, obviously the thought of not seeing my wife and kids is terrifying, and I think that really helps. That helped me get to the top. I remember that I would recite their names as I climb. So our youngest is Eric, our middle is Andrea, our oldest is Richard, and then my wife Janet, and I would step on their names. So it would be Eric, Andrea, Richard, Janet. I'd rest on Janet, and then right back. And as long as I was able to do that for hour after hour after hour, I thought I could make it to the top. And that mantra kept me going, but it sort of disappeared on the descent because it just turned into a survival fest.
After the Everest expedition, you didn't walk away unscathed. Tell us about your fingers. What happened there? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love, and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more kick-ass episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. After the Everest expedition, you didn't walk away unscathed. Tell us about your fingers. What happened there?
Yeah, so after Everest, what I'll say about Everest is on every mountain I've climbed, I felt a feeling of accomplishment at the top. If you look at the summit pictures closely on Everest, you can see I've got some tears in my eyes, but I think that's mainly because I'm really missing the family at that point. But I knew I wasn't done yet when I got to the top, and it actually took a few days, and until I passed the last objective hazard on Everest, which is way down near base camp. It's a big sort of serac of ice that can fall on you. I actually trotted by it because I didn't want that thing to fall on me. Then I thought, wow, I've climbed Everest. But yes, I did. I do have mementos of it, and I lost 3 fingers. So on the summit day, about 3 hours into the climb, I froze 3 fingers on my right hand, and I had them amputated a few months later after getting back to Canada. But small price to pay considering that 2 people on our expedition died. It's nothing I'm going to whinge and moan about, that's for sure.
Did the loss of those fingers affect your flying at all?
Yeah, it was interesting. Transport Canada, who's the civil aviation authority here in Canada, told me I wasn't allowed to fly until I had a medical flight test. So they took me into a simulator with a first officer, so a co-pilot, into a mountainous airport. So mountains are always more difficult to fly in, but as you know, I love mountains, and they just threw absolutely everything at me, everything possible to see if number one, I'd had brain damage from the lack of oxygen, and number 2, if I could manipulate all the switches in the airplane without those fingers. And
right.
it was no problem at all, but it was actually kind of fun, but it was unusual. I don't think Transport Canada has ever dealt with anything like that before, so they were going into uncharted territories.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to be a fly on the wall, like in The Office. You'd come back from an expedition. You've summited Everest, summited Aconcagua, and you rock back into work, and here he is again. That'd be interesting. Like all the accountants and sort of other.
It is. Yeah, they do. People do look a little askance at me at times at work, but it was a real interesting return to my day-to-day life. I think when you do something like that, whenever you're out on the edge and you're living life in those conditions, you're with your mates and you're in tents and you're literally living the way as young boys we all wanted to live, this high adventure, this right out of the pages of National Geographic, and it's life and death up there, and you're doing these incredible things, and next thing you know, you come back to work, and an administrator walks in and asks me if I want to pay this guy overtime for 3 hours of extra work, and if I'll approve it. And all I could think of is, a while ago, 2 weeks ago, the most important thing was that I had water in my water bottle and that my stove would light. And now I've got to deal with unimportant stuff like this. And I think it took Matthew about 3 months. And I don't know, looking back on it, I don't know if it's a little bit of PTSD, but a lot of people say that I was quite different for 3 months before I turned into myself again. And I think it was a withdrawal from living life right at the margins and then right back to normal life. Like, my wife asked me to fix something and pick up the groceries, and where you were fighting for your life just 2 weeks before. So really interesting. It's psychologically, it's a bit complicated coming back from a big trip.
Do you ever find at the end of a big trip, it's almost as though you've come off the drugs? Do you ever feel like a real downer in terms of, okay, this is now a chapter that, you've been training for and planning for many, many months or leading up to, and then you've completed that and that sort of chapter's closed. Do you ever get that feeling of coming down?
All the time. My wife calls it my post-expedition blues, where all of a sudden you're like, you spend 2 months on the North Atlantic, and literally 2 weeks before I landed in Europe, I was already starting to think about my next expedition. But I think that's a good thing. I think that we have to always have a goal in front of us, and not just dream, but a goal, meaning, everybody can dream, but a goal comes when you take a dream and you make a plan or you set a date to it. And I think that's incredibly important. If you don't have that thing to aim for, you're not going to train for it. You're not going to prepare for it. And I think that just gives me that little bit of jet fuel that I need to get through my life. It's something that is critical for me, that I always have something to aim for.
So with goal setting, do you sort of work backwards from a date? Like you've got a date in mind? Like let's just say you've got another massive expedition, like one in the future. and you've
Mm-hmm.
drawn a line in the sand. Okay, in a year and a half's time, I'm going to set off. Do you then work backwards from that date? Is that sort of how you go about goal setting and taking steps towards achieving a certain goal?
I actually do the opposite thing. First, I determine what the target's going to be. So whether it's a crossing or a mountain or running through Patagonia or a trip in the Canadian Arctic, whatever it may be, I do that first. So I take that idea, that concept, that project, and then I start to look at the timing. So the timing is going to be based on my work, on the family, on the preparation that's involved. So as an example, the ocean rowing plan was about 2 years. Didn't tell anybody about it. And then I started to do some research, sort of, maybe a few hints to Janet, my wife, and nothing to the kids. I started to research it some more. And then I basically took a list and I wrote out what I thought I needed to know to row the North Atlantic, being a non-ocean guy at all, like not even a bit of an ocean guy. And so I decided that I had to know how to navigate. I had to know on the ocean, which is pretty close to being what we do in aviation. A lot of the stuff was pretty easy for me, but then dealing with tides. So I did my Yacht Master ocean training or Yacht Master offshore training, did that online through a company here in Canada. And then I had to do my sea survival training. And then I just absolutely consumed everything I could on storm tactics in sailboats. Even though I wasn't sailing, it's the exact same concept, other than the fact you're not using sails for some of the maneuvers. But I read book after book after book on storm tactics. I brought them on the boat and I read them religiously because I wanted to be able to survive a storm no matter what. So I always planned for the best, but I was prepared for the worst at all times. And that's just because I made that list of what I had to do. So that list took me about a week to get all the items on that I thought I needed to do. And then I just started ticking them off. But building that program of education and preparation dictated the time and the time to construct the boat. So I looked at that. I set it up in a way that I'll be able to hit the early summer departure from Canada, the early summer of the Northern Hemisphere, from Canada. And I worked, so I started with the goal, and then I decided what I needed to do to achieve that goal, and then that gave me the time. So I worked backwards that way.
Yeah. So rowing solo across the Atlantic Ocean, what did your wife think when you said to her that, okay, my next adventure, I'm going to row solo across the Atlantic? What was she thinking?
That was tough. I mean, I remember, Matthew, and I told her I was going to climb Everest. I poured her a glass of Pinot Noir, red wine. We were sitting in our kitchen. I gave her 2 glasses of wine. She probably thought I had ulterior motives. And I said, babe, I think I'm going to go climb Everest without oxygen. Like in 3 months, I'm going to leave. And she said, without even pausing, without even blinking, without even raising an eyebrow, she took a sip of her wine and said, it's about time. You're not getting any younger. That was it.
All right. Yeah, that would have been good.
Yeah. So that was, thumbs up there. But then when it came to the ocean rowing thing, it was a real shocker for her. She goes, I didn't even know you had any inclination to cross an ocean. And I say, well, it's always been on my list. Just like when I went to ski the highest mountain in Iraq, she was completely shocked by that. She goes, I've never heard about this one. I said, well, there's lots of these goals that I have, or these projects that I have. And that one was especially poignant for us and especially difficult because we had lost in 2014 our oldest boy, Richard, at age 21. He had drowned canoeing up in the Canadian Arctic in a place called Norman Wells. He had just got a job there as a pilot, as a young pilot. He was only there for 21 days. He went out one evening with a young lady to take her canoeing, and they were only 20 meters from shore. And it's the second largest river in North America. It's called the Mackenzie River, and the canoe flipped, and she swam for shore. Richard, our son, stayed with the boat, and he drowned. And so for me to be going out on the ocean, obviously, if something went wrong, the cause of death out there would be drowning. It was especially difficult, and it really tore me up, to break the news to her that I wanted to do this. And then it caused a lot of questions for her on why I would do that. And, she basically, she warned me. She said, "You better not die out there. I've lost one to drowning. I can't lose two." So it was especially severe for our family. And I did everything possible to make sure that I was hyper safe. That sounds ridiculous when you're rowing a 6 meters boat across the North Atlantic, but I was prepared and I pulled it off. So she was shocked.
Did you sort of did that sort of help with the grieving process at all? Rowing from Halifax in Canada to, was it Brest in France?
Yeah, it does. I mean, anytime I'm out in the bush or out in the wild and sort of suffering, it really helps. I think it's my way of one of my ways of dealing with it, other than directly with Janet talking about our boy. But I think those moments help. I do a lot of there's a lot of tears that'll rise up during the hard times, and I know that after he died, I did a winter bike ride in the Canadian Arctic, and down to minus 46 degrees Celsius, riding a bike on ice. And it sounds crazy, but it was absolutely therapeutic and heart-wrenching, because I had ridden that road in the summertime, that same gravel Arctic highway with the kids, when Andrea, our daughter, was 11 and Richard was only 13. They're still the youngest people that have ever ridden that road. And it's a very remote, very, very remote area, and they did it. And to ride by those campsites that we occupied when they were young kids, and now they're drifting in with snow. And I cried a lot on that trip, but I think it helps, and it makes me takes me a little closer to Richard, and even to the point where my youngest son Eric and I canoed a river in the Arctic. That river, eventually we ended up in the Mackenzie River, and we canoed the river that Richard died in, because I wanted to confront it head on. So
with the Atlantic row, like you did that in 53 days, or just over 53 days. What was there like a particular point, or there would have been many, but was there one that sort of sticks out in your mind where you were really suffering, and did you sort of ever draw on sort of your son Richard's spirit to help you get through those sort of tough times?
Yeah, I think I did. I'm not a religious person at all, but I think I become spiritual when I get out into these places, onto these hard trips and hard places. And I think at times when I start to suffer, I really think about him and the rest of the family as well, but especially him. Just the absolute tragedy of dying at age 21 before you've really lived it all. And what it does is it really reminds me, even though I didn't need it, it certainly reminds me how short life can be, and how you have to just, go for it. You have to make these big plans. You have to do these ridiculous things like row oceans or climb big mountains or run ultra marathons. For me, or for anybody else, it could be something far smaller or far less grandiose. But thinking about Richard made me really realize that, not to give up, and to really relish where I was, and that I was living something. I experienced things that he'll never be able to experience, and I'm so lucky for that. But at the same time, I'm, it's just a tragic thing. There's no other word to describe it, to lose a child, and it's with you all the time. But it's something that has become our new normal, and during the hard times, it's certainly there.
Yeah. With these massive adventures that you go on, and all the suffering and pain physically and mentally that you go through, do you sort of find that the suffering helps to strip away the unessential stuff that you're clinging to, in your mind? And do you sort of find as though you continually sort of rediscover yourself on all of these expeditions?
I think your idea of it stripping away the unessential stuff is pretty accurate. it's like you're fasting from the stuff you don't need in your life. And I had some, some issues, and I don't want to get into any details, but on the water, some negative issues that came up through communications via email or either with sponsors or other things. And I really had to just say, I'm not dealing with this. I can't deal with the negativity. I cannot deal with somebody telling me, talking about how bad the storms are going to be or how big the waves are going to be or the number of people that die. And, you have to really get this mindset, you have to go out there and really kick arse, meaning that you have to do whatever it takes to remove the negatives without being naive about it, knowing that things are going to happen, but you have to get rid of the stuff that is not important. So what's important out there is obviously staying focused. I talked about that earlier, concern for task, and eliminating all that chaff in the background that you don't need, and just focusing on staying alive and getting to the end. And I think that if you get rid of that negativity when you're on these expeditions, it really helps, because it's easy to go down the negative hole, especially when you're stuck on sea anchor with a contrary wind blowing you back the way you came. You're losing miles by the minute, or by the hour, I should say. You're moving so slowly. And at those times, you're in sort of the depths of almost despair, that you're in the middle of the North Atlantic, you're going the wrong way. How long is this going to take? It's just going to be a horrible summer of suffering. But then next thing you know, you're moving forward again. And I think that's how it is with life. You go through downtimes, tragedies, you climb back out of it, and you continue to move forward. And I think that these expeditions that we do are much like life. Yeah. You just have to continue to move through the storms.
How do you manage those times when you've hit the wall and your mind starts to wander, and your mind just thinks of just crap. It's thinking of various things, this and that, and your mind sort of, sometimes when you're really, really suffering and you're really fatigued, you can sort of almost fall asleep in a way, and your mind you just go off with your mind. Do you sort of have any tips to let go of, whatever your mind's thinking about, to return to the present moment, or stay present, stay grounded?
I go back on previous expeditions, and I remember horrible times during the expeditions, either where I was close to dying, or I was in despair, or I was, about to lay down and take a nap on Everest, or I was, dying of altitude sickness in Bolivia. And I realized that you move through that, and when you look back on it, it's really not that big of a deal. It was just a moment in time. So even 4 days on sea anchor, drifting the wrong way in a cockpit in a boat that is literally 3 or 4 times the size of the inside of the average kitchen dishwasher is horrible at the time. You're getting thrown around in there. You're sick and you're scared. There's waves crashing over the boat. They're making noises against the boat where you think it's going to fall apart. But you just have to be analytical, and you have to be deliberate, knowing that the boat's constructed to take a ton of abuse, and that this storm will pass, that this dark night with towering waves is going to pass, and that I'm going to have a sunny day eventually and be moving forward with a tailwind. And I think that is in every expedition. I mean, how many times have you been running up a hill or cycling up a hill, and it's absolute suffering, but you're going to be rewarded on the other side by a downhill, right? And I think that's what you have to do in these tough times, is you just have to realize that this is not permanent. It's just temporary, and you're going to get through it. And when you look back, it's going to make it even sweeter. Yeah.
Did you encounter any massive storms in the Atlantic? And did you capsize at all?
Yeah, I capsized a lot. I didn't do the complete 360 or the barrel roll, even though the boat was designed to do that. So I'd go over. So if 90 degrees was right on edge, I'd go, 100, 120 degrees, but the boat always rolled upright. And I went through a lot of storms. And the reason that my passage was so fast was because I just got hit by storm after storm after storm, but pushing me in the right direction. Yeah. And at really high speeds for an ocean rowing boat. So I was very fortunate, but it was a hell of a rough ride to get across the North Atlantic for sure.
Were there any nights that were super clear? It's hard to imagine, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, let's just say the waves are relatively, it's fairly still. Were there many nights where you sort of looked up and it was just mind-blowing, the lights that you could see, from the stars?
Yeah, and I remember one night in particular where it was fairly calm, just about dead calm. And most of the trip in the North Atlantic is overcast and cool, like temperatures between about 8 and 12 degrees Celsius. But then as you get closer to Europe, it's quite a bit warmer. But as I was floating one night right in the middle of the pond somewhere, and it was dead calm, clear, space, the International Space Station over my head. And I remember that I can't remember which ocean rower it was, but he had crossed an ocean once, and his team had said, you're going to see the International Space Station pass over you. That's the closest human being to you right now. And I thought about that as they passed over me, that they would be the closest to me. And those are the moments that are far more tattooed on me than the big storms, where those nights like that where I would just stop rowing, or I'd be already in my sleeping bag and I'd just say, forget it, climb out on the deck, lay on my back flat and just stare at the stars floating out in the middle of the ocean. And, sometimes you'd be floating out there and a whale would pass by, or a dolphin would rise beside the boat. You couldn't see them, but you could hear them. And those are pretty special. And I'll never forget those nights, including some of the sunsets and the sunrises, just absolutely stunning.
Yeah. And what was it like when you saw Europe for the first time?
You know what? It was a lot like summiting Everest. It was very. It was at night, and I saw the light of a lighthouse, and I tweeted "land ho" is all I said, and I felt nothing because I knew that much like the descent of Everest, that the final few days were going to be very tough because of the fact that area of Europe has the highest tides in all of Europe, and I was going to be dealing with them going through a very narrow channel, so very strong currents and unusual waves and rocks and surf, and so I had been planning since July 20. What was it? It was actually close to a month beforehand how I was going to enter that harbor, and I was pretty focused on that part. So until I stepped on that dock, I much like passing that last Serac on Everest, I didn't consider it done. So I was land ho. Yeah, it's a bit of a milestone, but no sense of accomplishment until I was, right up to coming up to the dock.
Yeah. And what was it like when you stood on soil for the first time in sort of 53 days? What was that feeling like?
It was like being like drinking about 10 beer and trying to walk down a dock. I was all over the place. Had become so accustomed to life in a little tiny rowboat that I couldn't walk on solid land, and I was running into things, and I looked just like I was drunk. The video of me is pretty funny. I was zigzagging around, but it was pretty awesome to see Janet there. She met me, and it was interesting. I haven't told anybody this, but I took a little glance to the west across the ocean, and I remember thinking, bloody hell, I just rowed that boat across that ocean. And it was, you get a little bit choked up when you think about it, how big a goal that was and how far out of my comfort zone it was. And I was just like, like a real feeling of, I set this really tough goal and I pulled it off, and I pulled it off well. And it was, it felt good, but at the same time, like, what's next?
Just out of interest, this was in June last year, 2016. When you're back at work, you're flying a plane. Do any of the hosties, the hostesses on the radio say to the passengers, Captain Laval St Germain, ocean rower and Everest summiteer? Do they ever do that? Or?
You know what? I don't know if they've done that when I've been flying, but I've been on other airlines where they'll recognize my name and they'll make an announcement. They'll say, sitting in 15 Charlie is, and they announce who I am. And that's a little embarrassing, but it's also kind of funny. And sometimes passengers will get off and, they'll recognize me as if I stand in the cockpit door to say bye.
Yeah.
So, it's that's kind of neat. It's especially neat when you're riding as a passenger and on a different airline and they make an announcement. It's a little embarrassing, but it's I guess it comes with the territory.
Now, have you got anything else planned? You mentioned you want to tick off the final summit, the one in Antarctica. Is that sort of, are you actively working towards another expedition or adventure, or are you planning for something that you could share at all?
Yeah, I'm always planning something, and they're very diverse, from trail runs in the jungle to a polar trip. I'd love to go to the North Pole. I'd love to go to the South Pole, and I'm having a little trouble getting inspired right now to go to Vincent, just because the nature of climbing Vincent nowadays is you get on a chartered airplane and you fly near to the mountain, and then you ski up basically to the top, and it's really a very from a mountaineering standpoint, it's not very remote because there's going to be a lot of people climbing when you're there during the height of the Southern Hemisphere summer in December and January. And it's something that I will do. I don't really function on a bucket list. The only list that I've ever been known for is this 7 summit thing. I think the 7 summits are just an excuse to see the whole world and get some adventuring and exercise in at the same time. But Vincent will happen. It's just not something that's really eating at me because of the nature of it, that it's just a fly in, ski up, and like almost like bagging a peak, which I hate. So I'd like to combine it with something else in Antarctica. So that's a big project I'll be working on. But there's a desert I'd like to cross on fat bikes. I won't give it away yet because it's never been done, but I'd like to do a fat bike crossing of a remote desert, and some really cool trail runs too, some long trail runs in Europe and Southeast Asia. So there's always something going on. I just haven't really I've got that goal we talked about earlier. I just haven't set the date yet. Yep. So but there's always something.
Are you ever afraid that you're going to fail? Do you ever sort of take absolutely. That into consideration, or do you just sort of just leave it in your mind?
You mean like I'm going to fail and then not do the trip because I'm scared I'm going to fail?
No, like let's just say you're going to do another expedition. Are you ever afraid that at some point on the expedition you may fail due to injury, or that overwhelming desire to quit you might actually act on quitting? Is that sort of ever there in your mind?
Yeah, I'm always aware of that. And I think if you're going to do these types of things, you have to have fear for sure. If you don't have that fear, you're not going to be very safe, I don't think. Yeah. And anybody who tells you that they're not scared in the North Atlantic in the middle of a storm in a little boat is not telling you the truth, or that when you're walking along a knife edge ridge, it's not a little bit scary when you're mountaineering. So you have to have that fear. And I think that fear keeps you hyper alert and alive. And oh, absolutely. I'm always concerned about failing. I mean, when you shove off in a 6-meter rowing boat from Halifax, Canada, planning to row 5,200 across the ocean, there is a huge fear of failing there, and a huge fear of not making it, either because of weather or because of you failing physically, or because of you not having the necessary grit to do it, especially in an environment you've never been in. So yeah, that's always there. Always. I think it's important to have that.
Yeah. Of all your achievements so far, whether it's an adventurous achievement or not, is there a moment that really sticks out for you in terms of being your proudest moment? Whether it's summiting Everest or standing on French soil, or anything sort of smaller than that, is there anything that really stands out for you?
I mean, just because I'm a proud Canadian, I think that standing on Mount Logan was quite emotional. Canada's highest peak. I think some of my trips in the Canadian Arctic were emotional, just because I really love the North. I really love the Arctic. And but my proudest moments would be stuff that I've done with my kids in the outdoors. So, riding that Dempster Highway in the Canadian Arctic with Richard and Andrea when they were 11 and 13, that was pretty emotional when we got to the end.
Yeah.
And I was just so proud of them that they did that, and that we pulled it off as a team. These little kids who didn't even have an idea what they were doing. And then a few years ago, we went to Hong Kong and Japan, and Richard had already passed away, so it was Andrea and Eric and myself. Janet stayed in Tokyo, and we went and we climbed Mount Fuji and skied right from the summit. And it was I was on telemark skis. It was extremely steep in spots where you can't fall. It was like if you fall, you die, and very icy. And the clouds were rolling in, and our kids have grown up skiing and ski racing. In fact, they've all been ski coaches, and Eric just started this year as a ski coach. They're all expert skiers, and they just pushed off without hesitation, and they ripped down Mount Fuji, and talking and laughing and high speed without any concern. And that to me was it justified me putting them in outdoor sports, giving them that level of confidence, me putting them in skiing so they could just rip down Mount Fuji without even a consideration. And I was skiing down going, holy, if I fall here, I'm dead. And they didn't even, they just loved it. And that, I'll never forget that.
You said you've skied down a number of mountains.
Mm-hmm.
How long, is there a particular mountain that you've summited and then skied down that the ski part of it went for? How long does that take, sort of skiing down?
Well, Mount Logan is so big and it's such a long descent that it took us, it must have been 2 or 3 days to get down.
Yeah.
So you're not skiing the whole time, because sometimes you have to have your crampons on and crossing crevasses or climbing over ice and that type of thing. But it all depends on the mountain. I mean, the highest mountain in Iraq just took, I don't know, probably an hour and a half to get down from the top.
Yep.
And but then once you get off the highest mountain in Iraq, you have to contend with walking across landmine fields. And I eventually got captured by the Iraqi security forces and interrogated, and it was the most unusual ski mountaineering trip of my life. But so that was unusual. But yeah, they're all different. And
so what happened there? You got interrogated by the Iraqi army or police?
Yeah, so the Iraqi security forces. So I was climbing right on the Iranian border, and you're not supposed to be in that region. And somehow we had talked our way through. I had a fixer that I had met in Erbil in northern Iraq. And so he spoke Kurdish and Arabic. And we went through the last checkpoint near the Iranian border. And he said, "What's this guy doing here?" And he said, "Oh, he's just here to do some sightseeing. And then he's going back to Erbil." And what I was really doing was going to spend 7 days right along the Iranian border and climb the highest mountain in Iraq. And so he dropped me off, very nervous, and I said, "Pick me up back on this road in 7 days. I'll see you later." And I hiked into the snow line and eventually got on my skis and my crampons. And, after several days, I was on the summit. And on the way down, I was in a very remote area, and it was wintertime, so all the herders were in the lowlands, and they weren't up high. But on the way down, I found tracks that had looked like they'd been following me, and I even commented in this one video, they look like military tracks. So we got down. Ali, my fixer, was at the bottom. We got in the truck in the Toyota Corolla that he had, turned around, drove through the first checkpoint heading the opposite direction now, the last checkpoint on the road that we had previously been on a week before, and they nabbed me. They got my passport and realized that they'd been tracking me in the mountains. So they had got somehow figured out that I was in this border region you're not supposed to be in, because in 2009 in that area, 3 Americans were kidnapped by the Iranians, and some of them were held for up to 2 years. So they interrogated me and for about, I think it was about 4 hours or longer. And eventually it was kind of comical. They kept walking back and forth with my passport saying Canada and questioning if I was from Canada and what I was doing there. And then at the end, the guy says to me in English, the interrogator, he says, "Vancouver?" And I looked over at Ali, sort of wondering why would he ask me that. And I said, "No, Calgary." And he handed me my passport and said, "Have a nice day." And that was the end of it. I was gone.
Imagine if you were from Vancouver and he said yes.
Yeah, I don't know what
you would have locked you up.
But I remember on the same note, I remember walking by a remote prison in Iran, in the mountains of Iran. And I was very nervous because I was walking by this prison. I had to literally walk right past the guard towers. And there's the guard towers are probably about 200 meters apart. Like, so each side of the square that was the prison each corner was a guard tower about 200 meters apart. And as I walked by, the one guy in Farsi asked me where I was from. And I yelled up, I spoke a little bit of Farsi. I always try and learn some of the language and I'm there. And I said, Canada. And he said, oh, Toronto. And the other guy started yelling Canada, waving at me as friendly as can be.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So my Canadian passport's been handy a few times.
Yeah, no, that's good. Whereabouts can people find you online and follow your future adventures and say hi and support you and stuff like that?
Yeah, so go to my website. So it's lavalstgermain.com. So LavalStgermain.com. There's a contact us link there, but I think most people now are just social media is the best way to get a hold of me. So Twitter, so Laval St Germain, all one word, no period after the T. So at Laval St Germain and at Laval St Germain on Instagram. And yeah, feel free to reach out. Send me a message. I get lots of questions and invites to speak at things because of what I do. And you can see some of my photos and adventures there.
Yeah, well, it's been great speaking with you. And it's not very often that you get to speak to someone who's done some incredible things like yourself. And I'll put those links in the show notes. But before you go, I just wanted to ask about flat Earth. I've been getting into flat Earth theory, like on YouTube, and you sort of go crazy. From high up, what's your sort of thoughts on that? Can you see the curvature of the Earth? Or
I could honestly tell you, I've done a lot of interviews, Matthew, and this is the first time I've ever been asked about flat Earth.
Yeah.
You can see some of the curvature from the Earth once you get sort of over 10,000 meters when you're flying. But
yeah,
I don't know. Are these guys Trump supporters? Who are these people that believe in flat Earth? I'm not.
Sometimes, on YouTube, you just sort of follow the rabbit hole down, and next, you're sort of watching some. You get into the conspiracy theories and stuff like that. But
well, I do know that where you're sitting is on the other side of this little blue globe that we're sitting on, and a long way from here. So it's definitely not flat down in Australia. But I think what you're doing, Matthew, is really exemplary. I think the fact that you are speaking to these strange people that do these things all over the world, to these people that that disappear into the mists at high mountains or over the horizon on oceans, and then trying to pick our minds. I think it's very valuable, and I'm really flattered you had me on the podcast. You're doing a great job, so thank you.
Yeah, well, no, thanks for your time, and it is. It's great, trying to find out from someone who's living proof that going beyond your comfort zone and achieving these incredible things is possible, and trying to take those pearls of wisdom that you impart and trying to implement that in your sort of day-to-day life. I think that's it's an incredible thing. But
well, thanks very much. Really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope to talk to you after my next adventure. And I'll keep listening to your podcast when I go for my next run.
Yeah, cool. Well, definitely keep in touch, and I'll look forward to hearing about your next adventure.
Excellent.
All right. Yep. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Cheers.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.